Hello, everyone. This is the final chapter, and so this is just a brief overview of some of the key ideas, concepts within the chapter. And so let's get started. Let me go here. Oh, went too far. All right, so one of the key ideas in this chapter is this idea of color blindness. And I have been hearing frequently, at least more frequently in the last 4 or 5 years, people who are against things such as affirmative action or equity programs, etc., who argue that Martin Luther King famously said that he had a dream that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so these individuals use Dr. King's words to argue that Dr. King would never have wanted us to pay attention to skin color. Dr. King would never have been supportive of affirmative action or equity programs, etc. And the reality is this: Dr. King was referencing what he believed or hoped might be a time in the future when that would be possible, where his children would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. He did not say that that's the way the society is now. At his time, and it's certainly, I don't think many people could argue legitimately or persuasively that we are at a place in our society where skin color doesn't matter. Of course it does. And the reality is this: it's not a bad thing to see skin color. If we are honest, we are humans and we all see skin color. And we see a variety of things. We see height and weight. We see skin color. We judge sexual orientation, regardless of whether or not we really should, but we do it. We judge gender. We judge religion, even sometimes. We judge political parties. We don't even know for sure if the things that we perceive about someone are true. We do it anyway. We judge or we make conclusions about someone when we are interacting with them or if we see them from afar even. And so the reality is that skin color, gender, sexual orientation, even at times religion, as well as other characteristics, personal characteristics that we have, are used by others to discriminate against us at times, perhaps to stigmatize that characteristic about ourselves, to create programs, to justify legislation that creates an inequality or an injustice in society. Okay, to believe that colorblindness is the solution is naive. In fact, as you've come to the conclusion of this course and you think about racism, of course no one's going to say that they're racist. No one's going to admit that they're racist. But I think I've said in the past in a lecture that I'm always reminded about a book that was written by a sociologist. I think at the time he was at UC San Diego. His last name is Bonilla. And the title of the book, quite aptly, is Racism Without Racists. And in that book, what he talks about is how in the United States, we have a lot of racism, racist policies, racist institutional institutions, etc. And yet, how is it possible that we have all this racism in society when no one is a racist? It's a conundrum, for lack of a better word. So the other thing that we really have to consider is that often people use color blindness, or Martin Luther King's words, as some sort of shield for justifying their own privilege, right? For justifying why they have more of something, whether that's better quality education, better access to jobs, etc. They point out that, look, This is a colorblind society. Color doesn't matter anymore. Therefore, if I'm successful, it's all of my own accord. And if somebody else is not successful, it's because that person is lazy or hasn't tried hard enough, or, any number of things. Um, oops, go. So let's think about multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. So, as the authors suggest, and I agree with them, colorblindness is really not a concept that's very useful. If we really want to push positive um, change, and to create more social justice in not only our own society, but society around, countries around the world. Multiculturalism, um, people started talking about it in the early 1970s, and it really took off in the 80s. And so all through the 90s, there were multicultural centers that sprang up all across campuses. Even by the late 80s, some campuses were having these multicultural centers, etc. And the idea, of course, is that society should take diversity into account. Diversity of all kinds, not just racial diversity, but diversity in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, etc., religion, you name it. And that each group or each individual should be valued for their own sake, right? So that if we see somebody who's gender nonconforming, or somebody who identifies as gender nonconforming, or someone who identifies as non-binary, that we value that individual for their own sake because they are humans. Um, on the other hand, while to some extent America maybe has, at least partially, I don't know if it's always been multicultural, I don't know if I agree with that, but that push to be more multicultural in how we think about difference, at least for the last 45, 50 years, has really been present in the US. But there's a new idea, and Elijah Anderson, a sociologist, is often credited with creating this idea of cosmopolitanism. It's this idea that people, as they engage with one another through their daily activities, whether in school or at work or um, in soccer leagues, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, whatever, parent teacher association, whatever daily things we have that are part of our lives, as we engage with people who are different from ourselves, that observation that we have, that personal observation that we have, in regard to the person or persons, um, through those daily interactions, we're able to casually observe who they are, excuse me, and to begin to appreciate one another's differences, and to begin to actually empathize with them, begin to really fully, quote, step in the shoes of someone else, because through that daily interaction, through those interactions with others, we are casually observing what it means to be that person. Now, of course, we cannot fully understand this because we're not in that person's skin, we're not fully in that person's shoes, but we begin to have some degree of understanding and some degree of empathy. That's the idea of cosmopolitanism. And of course, as the authors of the text point out, there are some people who argue that cosmopolitanism is problematic because it creates more division within society, as opposed to the more melting pot idea of, oh, we all come here, we all, melt into one new identity, that of American. There are some who argue that multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism both create divisions within society. In fact, there are probably some people who might argue today that that's one of the problems with the identity politics we have and all the division in society. It's because of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism, where we are promoting this idea that everyone should be respected as the individual that they are, rather than being thought of as part of this larger national community. However, you know, no idea is going to be without critics. So just being honest that there are some critics of these two ideas. When we think about what does it mean to live in a democratic society, and I don't mean big D, you know, democratic political party. I'm talking about the small d, democratic ideals. And where do we look for those? Well, at least in theory, we look at some of our founding documents for this country. The idea that people inherently have a right to pursue life and liberty and happiness. That's part of the democratic ideal. Also, thinking about how people should be enabled to fully to fully become whatever they might be, given their talents, their skills, their abilities. And part of the democratic ideals is also recognizing that not everyone has the same access to opportunities, to privileges, to resources, etc. And so for democratic ideals, yes, we want to honor the idea that everyone should have access to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. But we also have to recognize that not everyone has the same opportunity to pursue those things for various reasons. So, racial democracy requires that we recognize that racial injustice is rampant. Two major examples, housing and education. I'd also add a third one though, that's the criminal justice system. In fact, there are some people who are advocates for reform of that system, and rather than call it a criminal justice system, because they say that's a misnomer, and I agree with them, justice has very little to do with that system. They coined a new term. They call it the carceral system, C-A-R-C-E-R-A-L, carceral system, because they say there's nothing about what happens in that system that is about justice, and I very much agree. Also, we want people to be able to draw on societal resources, have access to these resources, commensurate with the value that they put into them, right? So we want children who want a quality education to have access to that. And for their parents who pay taxes and pay into public school systems, their children should have access to quality education, not just wealthy parents, because everyone is paying taxes. And of course, we think of racial democracy also means that we think of everyone as contributing to society in some way. Doesn't mean that everybody's contributing in the same way, but everybody's contributing in some way, however that might be, to the best of their abilities. Not everybody's going to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or an architect, etc. But everyone is contributing to society in some way. At least that's the premise. And we know that there are people who might not, but that's the general premise. Thinking about change. How do we change things? Well, the author suggests that there are two levels at which change can occur. One is at the individual level. We can work on ourselves, but the other is also the institutional level. What do we do about the social institutions and how they operate? So first, let's think about ourselves. If we're interested in trying to really, on a deeper level, understand who we are we really anti-racist, or do we tend sometimes toward being more racist, toward being more prejudiced, etc.? Then that requires some very deep reflection about how we see the world around us. And so, first off, one of the things that we can do, and again, a lot of this requires work, and not everybody's going to be able to do all of these things all at once. We might be able to do some of it sometimes and not at other times. But one thing we can do is when we have the opportunity we can try to put ourselves into social environments where we're not used to, right? So we can go to, if you've never, if you don't really understand what BLM is, you can go to a BLM meeting, or you can go to a BLM protest and talk to people there and protest. Very deliberately putting ourselves in social environments that we know very little about can help us to understand at a deeper level what the group is really about. Also, excuse me, we can reflect on how we think about the world around us. We can ask ourselves, are some of the things that I think about when I see someone who looks a particular way, is that perhaps based on racism or sexism or homophobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or any number of isms out there? Are my assumptions true? How do I know that the world really works this way? I mean, going back to, quote, the criminal justice system, many people take it for granted that it is a system of justice. But if you actually study that system, as I have in law school, and of course continue to read cases that come before the Supreme Court, you recognize that there are so many opportunities for injustice to occur at all levels, starting with the police, then getting to the prosecutor's office, who gets charged, who doesn't, who gets a good plea bargain, who doesn't, and then going to trial and then appeals. You start to really understand that there are so many opportunities where injustice can occur. And then just considering how our own upbringing, how our own social environment growing up, who we had around us, the kinds of things that they taught us, etc. That maybe without realizing it, we still cling to without really understanding why we do. How does that maybe influence the way we think about the world around us and the people who are different from ourselves? Also, if we really want to understand others and have them understand ourselves, then we really have to make sure that we understand that the very first step is not yelling at someone, not calling them stupid or ignorant or any number of names that we could call someone with whom we disagree. And also realizing that their ideas are important to them. Their ideas matter too. You may not agree with them, but they're entitled to have them. And recognize that their ideas, their beliefs might also be tied to their own experiences, much as your own are. I'm the first one to admit that as a sociologist, I am a conflict theorist because of the way I grew up, because of growing up in the 60s and the 70s as a Mexican kid from an immigrant family whose parents had very little education. I know that I look at the world around me in a different way than somebody who came from a second or third or fifth generation Mexican family. I know that. And so a key point as well is if we want someone else to listen to us, then we have to listen to them too. I mean, and when I say listen, I mean truly listen, not just pretend to be listening and all the while thinking about all the things you're going to say to rebut what that person just said. I mean, truly looking at that person and listening. Doesn't mean you agree, but you're listening. In fact, one of the things that I think is really important when we're doing this kind of work is after someone has said, made their ideas known, their opinions known, is paraphrasing it so that when you paraphrase it back to that person, you have the opportunity to make certain that you actually understood what they said. So if someone finishes telling you why they're against affirmative action, for example, then you can repeat back to them. So this is what I'm hearing you say. I think you're saying that you are against affirmative action for X, Y, and Z reasons. And then that gives the person to say, yes, that's exactly right. Or to say, no, you misunderstood me. that first point was right, but you misunderstood my other 2 points. And that's how you can get to a better understanding, because sometimes even when we're really truly are listening, we're not actually getting the message that the person intended for us. So by paraphrasing back their ideas to them, it gives them the opportunity to confirm or not whether we heard them correctly. And of course, asking questions, and not sarcastically, not in a presumptuous way or not in a demeaning way, but really just genuine questions. You know, I really am trying to understand this situation. Here's what I know, here's what I think. What are your thoughts? And then enabling that person just to tell you, here's how I view it. Again, not saying that we're going to agree, but just really being honest about our curiosity, and being sincere about it, not just doing it to piss somebody off. And then finally, doing your own homework. If you really want to change someone else's mind, or you really at least want to provide them more accurate information, then you've got to be on your own A game. You've got to know what the statistics are. You've got to know what the policy is, etc. This reminds me of an email recently that a colleague of mine sent out to the sociologists in the department. This is not at the University of Laverne. This is at East LA College. He's an adjunct instructor there, as I am now. And he honestly said, I'm having difficulty explaining to other people this particular concept. And while I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, I'm hearing people say things that also make sense about why they're opposed to it. And so I'm just curious, how do some of you out there respond to some of these points? And so really what he was doing is he was trying to ask for help in understanding the viewpoints of these others, and also help for clarifying his own ideas and his own positions. And so that's okay too. That is okay too, to ask others, can you help me understand this better? That's a genuine question. And of course, you don't necessarily need to win, right? It's not about winning, it's really about learning. And sometimes you may find that your mind has changed slightly about something, or that you hadn't thought about things in a particular way. So that's change at the interaction level for the individual. And then we go to the institutions, thinking about how our institutions operate, and thinking about how much of the way that our social institutions operate we take for granted. We don't really question or challenge, for the most part, why history is taught a particular way in the K through 12 school systems, or why we think about the way that jobs, most jobs or most workplaces operate. We just take it for granted. Well, that's the way they've always done it. That's the way it's always going to be. And of course, we're not going to change things with just one training or a few trainings, or a single conversation with a coworker. It's not going to happen that way. These are long, it's a long process to change things at the institutional level. Indeed, we're still trying to change them. 1964, when the Civil Rights Act passed, has been almost, since we're in 2022 now, almost 70 years ago. Is that right? No, 60 years ago, almost 60 years ago. And we're still working on trying to make these social institutions, housing, education, voting, government, healthcare, workplaces, etc. We're still trying to work on making these places much more equitable. So it doesn't mean that we have to, we can, rest on our laurels like, oh yes, we've got all this change, we've passed, all these laws have been passed, etc. It's kind of like, I view it as like a relationship. You can't just find a partner, a life partner, and once you two figure out, okay, yeah, we like each other, okay, we're going to make a commitment. whether married or not, you can just let the relationship go, right? You don't have to work on it anymore, or a friendship, or a family relationship. Personal relationships always require work. We can't just set it and forget it. And the same is true of working on institutional change. We have to always be working on change and always be cognizant that if we forget to work on it or we stop working on it, things can often go back to the way they were quite quickly. So of course, some ideas here, anti-discrimination laws and affirmative action, we have some of those things, but of course, we're still working on trying to get more equity into our social institutions. So we've got to continue working on these and pushing for more equity. Collective action, of course, coming together with others, unions go on strikes. We may boycott products or services that we deem to be, whose policies we deem to be racist or homophobic, etc. And there was a while there when some people, I've never had Chick-fil-A, but some people were boycotting Chick-fil-A because it's owned by a religious family and they are quite homophobic. So sustained boycotts. When I was a kid, we didn't eat grapes. We didn't, because we supported the United Farm Workers Union, and grapes were something that were boycotted. So we just didn't eat them because my parents had been farm workers, and so they were strong believers in supporting farm workers, and so we just didn't eat grapes for a really long time. Probably till like the early 1980s, we didn't eat grapes for like 10 years. It just wasn't something you did because you wanted to support the farm workers. Public demonstrations, marches and protests, rallies, etc., civil disobedience, being willing to get arrested because you're blocking a path to something. And then racial uprisings, of course, that happens as well. And I guess you could even say what happened in January 6th was also collective action, right? Destructive collective action, but collective action nonetheless. All right, so I'm going to leave it there and hope that at some point you have more of an opportunity. I know when you're in school, it's difficult to really think about making changes, at least on an individual level, and really engaging in some of this deeper thinking and putting yourself in different social environments. But hopefully at some point you will be willing and able to do that on a deeper level. And I hope that you have learned at least a few helpful things in this course, and I also hope that those things that you learned you'll be able to apply to your work or to your relationships with people in the various social environments where you live your lives. So I wish you all well, and especially on the final exam.